What is up, everyone? Welcome back to Julio GTV. Today we are moving forward with episode 2 of The Decree. Remember, The Decree is the show where I bring you the latest from a local, national, and global standpoint with a focus on those legal aspects and the overall goal of uncovering the truth. And so today we are going to be talking about a local issue or event, and that's going to be some New Mexico legislation. So to me, local is New Mexico, or even more local than that, city, towns within New Mexico. And yes, New Mexico is a state, the land of enchantment. We are a state. We are part of the United States. I know that sometimes there's some confusion or some unsurety about that. And so, yes, we're going to be talking about New Mexico legislation today, and that's going to be on House Bill 129, which is a firearm bill and Second Amendment bill, so to speak, as it does have those Second Amendment implications. So before we jump into that, we do want to recognize our sponsor of this video, and probably every video going forward, is Clarity Multimedia. They're responsible for our pre and post production and everything before, during, and after. And so if you want some services related to photography, videography, or graphic design, social media, internet marketing, any other media needs, you could check them out at www.claritymultimedia.com. Again, www.claritymultimedia.com. All right, everyone, let's go ahead and jump into this New Mexico legislation. The legislation today that we're going to be talking about is regarding the sale, transfer, and possession of firearms here in the state of New Mexico. This particular bill, House Bill 129, was passed by this year's session and by the 56th legislature, and it was signed by the governor, and so it will become New Mexico law effective May 15th, 2024. Just a little tip on the effective date. You'll see in this bill, I will have links to the text of this bill and a couple other bills that are related, particularly, I believe it's Senate Bill 9 related to possession of firearms near polling places. So I'll have those links with some of those others if you're interested. But you'll see in the text of House Bill 129 here that the effective date's not included in the text. And so if you're like me, like to geek out, and you don't see, the effective date in this legislation, I'll tell you, you'll have to look to the legislative calendar, particularly for New Mexico. And so for this bill here, that's where we get the effective date. And so what is House Bill 129? What does it do? Again, it's related to the sale, possession, and transfer of firearms, particularly during that purchasing stage when you initially, pay for the firearm and take possession of it. In this case, this law is going to impose a 7-day waiting period for the state of New Mexico. So what does that mean? Essentially, right now, under federal law, FFLs, or federal firearms licensees, essentially those that are authorized under federal law to sell a firearm, are required to run what we call federal instant background checks, or NICS checks. The statute here refers to them as federal instant background checks. Essentially, if you ever purchased a firearm before, when you go into the FFL, whether it's a sporting goods store or other local store, you'll know that, once you pick out your firearm or whatever it may be that requires a background check, that's one of the first things you're going to do before you even get to, take possession of it officially, aside from inspecting it. That, if an FFL is following the customary practice, you're going to have to do a background check. Right now, under federal law, particularly Section 18 USC 922, and then the regulation associated would be 27 CFR 478, a FFL may transfer a firearm to a transferee, which would also mean a buyer. So a transferee would be a buyer. As soon as the FFL receives a proceed from the federal instant background check or the NICS check. However, there is a caveat to that. Right now, under federal law, those that I cited, it states if a FFL does not receive a final proceed or a denied response from the check, that the FFL must wait 3 business days until they could actually transfer that firearm to the buyer. So right now, typically, again, if you've purchased a firearm before, you'll know that most often, if there's no issues with your background check, you're going to leave with that firearm within minutes. Sometimes some individuals will have issues for whatever reason with their background. Might be a name, name change, things of that nature that could complicate a background check. And they might have to come back in a day or two to retrieve the firearm once that FFL gets a proceed answer from the check. However, sometimes there are instances in which the FFL doesn't get an answer from the background check within those 3 days that are required under federal law. In those instances, depending on who you purchased the firearm from, they could technically transfer it or release it to your possession after those 3 days. Or depending on who the federal firearm licensee is, they might have a policy in place to where they say, yeah, we know we could release it after the 3 days. However, our policy is until we actually get an answer, we're not going to release the firearm to you. So keep note of that. That's what's currently in effect now and what you should expect if you've never purchased a firearm and you're going to go purchase one here in the state of New Mexico before May 15th. However, now we have House Bill 129, and effective May 15th, it will be a crime for any FFL to sell, transfer a firearm to a buyer within 7 days or not waiting until after a 7-day waiting period. So effectively, you're going to have to wait 7 days, if not longer, once we dive into the bill here, to actually get possession of your firearm after May 15th. So until then, still under that federal scenario that I mentioned just a second ago, but after May 15th, this is what's going to be in effect. So essentially, House Bill 129 will be codified in the New Mexico laws as Section 37-7.3. Official name of the laws is New Mexico Statutes Annotated. These are the statutes, again, enacted by the legislature of the state of New Mexico. I think the easiest way to go through this would just read the more pertinent sections. I am going to skip over a couple just for the sake of being as brief as possible, but we could go ahead and jump right into subsection A. And so that states, a waiting period of 7 calendar days shall be required for the sale of a firearm and the transfer of the firearm to the buyer. The 7 calendar day waiting period shall include the period required to conduct a federal instant background check. That's the 3 days I had just mentioned. Provided that if the 7 calendar day waiting period has expired without the completion of a required federal instant background check, the seller shall not transfer the firearm to the buyer until the federal instant background check is completed. If the required federal instant background check has not been completed within 20 days, the seller may transfer the firearm to the buyer. So what does that mean? So essentially, the 3 days that I had mentioned earlier under the federal law regarding the 3-day business day waiting period that FFLs are currently subject to is included within the 7-day waiting period. So you're not going to have to wait 3 additional days and wait 10 days. It's just the 7-day if the federal background check is completed. Now, the issue here is if it's not completed within 20 days, then the seller may transfer it to the buyer. So that means you could be waiting 20 days versus what's currently in place now, 3 days. And so there's two interpretations that can be made from this completed language. One, does it mean that you did the NICS or federal instant background check at all, which I think that'd be rare circumstances. So I don't necessarily think it's getting to that as that's standard and customary. What I think it's getting at is what's currently in place under federal law, which is if the FFL doesn't get a proceed or other answer within the 3 business days, then they could release it. I think it's doing the same thing here, except instead of the 3 days, now if there's not an answer given to FFL in the state of New Mexico, they could release it after 20 days. So that's a 17-day increase as opposed to what's currently in place under those federal laws I mentioned earlier, if no answer is given to the FFL. So that is an incredible increase, particularly if it's for recreational purposes. You need to purchase something, within that time period, especially now if it goes through quickly, you can purchase it the same day. Again, we'll talk about some of the pros and cons and how that could affect it, getting a firearm at a later date. It does serve the waiting period purpose a little bit more, but in terms of the federal background check, which a lot of people call the loophole, it's still allowing release of the firearm without an answer is what the interpretation looks to be, as opposed to doing the federal background check at all. So that's what we're looking at there with subsection A. Of course, subsection B pretty much states that it has to remain in the seller's possession or the FFL's possession during the background check and during the entirety of the waiting period, so the 7 days. Subsection C, I want to draw your attention to where it starts with but does not include temporary possession or control of the firearm provided to a customer by the proprietor of a licensed business in the conduct of that business. So this pretty much means when you go in to purchase a firearm, you temporarily get possession of the firearm, you're looking at it, inspecting it, seeing which one you want. That's not covered here, and so it's not going to be unlawful for you to inspect, look at, and take a look at those firearms while you're there in engaging in the business of purchasing a firearm. The next thing I want to draw your attention to is what's the crime if someone violates this section. It's going to be whoever violates the provisions of the section is guilty of a misdemeanor. So again, that's subsection G. The other important part of this is subsection H, which are the exceptions to this rule, essentially, meaning these are you won't be subject to that 7-day waiting period if you fall in one of these categories. And there are 5 categories here. The first one being it wouldn't apply to a buyer who holds a valid federal firearms license. So if you are an FFL or a federal firearms licensee, you won't be subject to the 7 days. You could get it as usual, and you're good to go. The next one would be to a buyer who holds a valid New Mexico concealed handgun license pursuant to the Concealed Handgun Carry Act. I am glad they included this in here because then it would defeat the purpose of a waiting period. We'll get into the pros and cons of waiting period and why they're being enacted across the nation, and some of those that are advocating for them, what the reasons are. But essentially, if they didn't include this in here, it would defeat the purpose of it, essentially because someone who holds a valid New Mexico concealed handgun license most likely already purchased a firearm and they already have access to a firearm, and so the waiting period wouldn't apply given that they already have a firearm. So I'm glad they included that, but I have to say I'm disappointed to see that they didn't include those who have lawfully purchased and responsibly maintained possession of a firearm. New Mexico does allow for open carry, as they call. And so anyone that's lawfully purchased a firearm, they most likely already have a firearm and access to that firearm immediately, which would defeat the purpose of a waiting period. Again, we'll get into the pros and cons, but I just wanted to point that out. Also, it doesn't apply to a law enforcement agency between 2 law enforcement officers. 3 and 4 pretty makes sense, self-explanatory. Number 5, I'm glad they included this in here because, there's pros and cons to it, but it at least gives you the ability to transfer it to a family member that, of course, I would recommend that you ensure that they are going to be responsible. You don't want to transfer it to someone just because they're an immediate family member. You want to be responsible in transferring and things of that nature. And so An immediate family member would be anyone included in subsection I2. So you guys could check that out to see who would be included there. So essentially, there you have it, guys. That's House Bill 129, effective May 15, 2024. If you wait to buy a firearm until then, you're going to have to wait the 7 days unless this law is otherwise struck down or challenged and then struck down. That's what we'll be subject to here in New Mexico. So now we want to talk about, what's the reason behind enacting a law like this? Well, there's pros and cons. Let's talk about those who advocate for it. One is the waiting period. They state acts as a cooling off period. So, whether it's a heat in the moment situation or a situation where you're very angry or sad or whatever the emotion might be, you won't otherwise be able to access a firearm within the same day or day after, or whatever it may be. You're going to have to wait the 7 days to purchase the firearm legally. And there has been some studies done. I won't cite to them here. However, you could take a look at those. Those legislators and others advocates for these waiting periods have stated that these cooling off periods or waiting periods allow those individuals in those situations that either have an intent to commit an unlawful crime against someone or use it to do something unlawful, or unfortunately in some scenarios harm themselves. They are going to have a period of time to cool off, essentially, as they would say, quote unquote, and may be more unlikely to commit the crime or harm themselves. And so that's a big proponent for these laws. The flip side of that would be, of course, what's the implication on your ability to protect yourself and exercise your Second Amendment right? There have been, other cases. Again, I'll let you guys search those and find them. One particular case was there was one individual. She sought to protect herself by obtaining a firearm, primarily because she was in a domestic situation with a significant other or spouse that had communicated to her that he had an intent to harm her. She wanted to protect herself. Unfortunately, she was subject to one of these waiting period laws. She was unable to obtain a firearm for protection. Not saying that we know 100% she would have been able to utilize the firearm in a fashion that would have enabled her to protect herself and or prevented. She did eventually pass away from that crime of that individual eventually who did carry out the crime that he communicated to her. But those are some of the the popular competing views of these cooling off periods. Okay, one, we are recognizing the benefit of waiting in those situations. However, that same purpose of waiting may be a detriment as opposed to a benefit for others, particularly those that just want to have some protection, especially in their home, as that individual did want protection for, and against other violent actors out there, especially when someone has communicated that to you. I'll leave it up to you guys to see which side you fall on, so that way you can make more informed decision on yourself and act accordingly. So now we want to talk about what are some of the constitutional implications. Well, it's important to note that this bill, the draft form, did propose a 14-day waiting period and then a 30-day period at the end of that subsection A that we saw there in the initial draft. But once this bill made it through committee, I believe the House Judiciary Committee, they proposed these amendments, which would then become the 7-day and 20-day periods that we see in the bill now, in order for them to approve or a yes on it, essentially. And I think the reason they made that is because of the current landscape of this waiting period, because there have been some laws enacted across the nation and some other Second Amendment cases that have been brought before the Supreme Court. While this technically isn't an outright ban on possession of firearms that we might see more applicable in the classic and more popular case, Supreme Court case of D.C. v. Heller, we do have a case out of the Ninth Circuit, which is Sylvester v. Harris, that states that a 10-day waiting period for all firearm purchases was upheld. Now, I'll point out that New Mexico is not in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. We're actually in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. However, as us attorneys would say, it's not technically binding precedent, but we could use it as persuasive authority if something was to be brought here in the 10th Circuit. Federal courts are likely to look at the other federal courts for guidance and most often follow that guidance. There is some exceptions to that depending on the circuits you're talking about. But I'm assuming they took a look at these cases and took the safer route, went with that less than 10-day. However, if that background check isn't run and you're looking at the 20-day, that piece may still be unconstitutional if we're looking at the Ninth Circuit. Now, does that mean that this case will be upheld or it could be overturned? Or otherwise? I think this could be appealed further or challenged in another state that would essentially overrule or overturn this Ninth Circuit case, especially if it was a U.S. Supreme Court case that put a definite line in the sand of what amount of days, if any at all, would be constitutional and not infringe upon the Second Amendment. Until then, that's what we have. The other thing I will mention, though, is we did have the Bruin case that came down in the U.S. Supreme Court. And that case, some other legal scholars and professionals have opined that it's broadened the Second Amendment right in terms of access to the firearms and possessing firearms, in that it's opened the door to more state laws, particularly being challenged after that case. And so, will we see a challenge to this law or other laws? There's a possibility. It's just a matter of those making the efforts and taking the necessary action to engage in that process in order to challenge them. But until then, that's what we have, and that's the landscape of it. And so, there you have it, guys. House Bill 129, the 7-day waiting period for the sale, transfer, and possession of firearms here in the state of New Mexico, the land of enchantment. That would be after May 15th, 2024. So, again, if you're looking to purchase a firearm for whatever reason, recreational, protection, or just to exercise your Second Amendment, please be aware, plan accordingly. If you guys have any other questions that you'd like me to answer, drop them down below in the comment section, and I'll either answer them there or create a new video. And as always, I would appreciate it if you guys could hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like, turn on the notifications so you know when I upload new content. If you keep supporting, Julio G TV will keep growing. I really appreciate you all watching. Until the next one, take care.